Hello and welcome to this introductory tutorial on JavaScript modules. In this tutorial I'm going to be showing you how you can better organize your code and increase the efficiency of your JavaScript using modules. So to demonstrate a couple of use cases of modules, I've created this index.html file with a linked script, so script.js, so nothing different from normal here. And in my script.js file, I have three utility functions. So these are three functions that I might use in a project. The first one formats currency for me. The second one generates a unique ID. And the third one is a reusable function for making HTTP requests using fetch. So these are three functions that I might want to use in my project, and I can integrate them into a project in this way by just defining them in script.js, and then at the top of my file I could call, for example, format currency. I'm going to call generate ID because that doesn't require me to pass anything into it, so it's nice and simple. And if I head over to the browser, you'll see that this will return a numeric ID to me. So I've got this ID here with the underscore. This is a timestamp and then a random number. Okay, but this isn't the best solution for this. So the first issue is, as you can see, my script is already cluttered and I haven't even really got going writing any new code here. And this is just with three functions. In a project I might have many more functions that I want to make available to me. And the second problem is efficiency. So I'm actually loading all three of these functions, even though I might not use any of them, or I might only use one. What I'd really like is a solution where I only load the functions that I am actually going to use in my code. So what I'd rather do is have some clean code down here for this all to be empty, and then for me to be able to call these functions at the top of my script. So that's something that we can solve with modules. So to get started with modules, first of all, you have to make a change to the script tag in HTML. And what you have to do is you have to add an attribute, and that's the type attribute, and the value of this needs to be module. So what you're effectively doing here is telling the browser that this is no longer an ordinary script, but a part of interconnected scripts. When they're interconnected, they're known as modules, and then we're going to be able to share functionality between scripts. So don't forget this, the attribute, otherwise none of this will work. And the second thing to mention with getting started is modules won't work locally. You have to run them on a server. Now, if you're using Visual Studio Code like I am, you can download an extension, very popular one, Live Server. And then once you've installed that, you can right-click on your HTML document and select Open with Live Server. And that's going to open a live server for you with this HTML document. You can also click down here in the corner. I've already started my live server. So something about running a live server means every time we save it automatically updates. So just watch out for that. So heading back to script.js, I want to find a solution to this so I can store these functions somewhere else and then call them when needed. So I can do that with modules. And so the first thing I'm going to do is create a module where I'm going to be storing the format currency function and also the generate ID function. I'm going to be creating a separate module for this, my fetch function, in a little while. So the first thing I'm going to do is to create a new so modules are just JavaScript files. They're just called modules, but there's nothing different about them other than that they're interconnected. So I'm going to call this helper functions.js. And inside helper functions.js, I'm going to copy these two functions. So they are now outside of my script.js file. So there's already a bit less clutter here, but I've still got this fetch function. So don't worry about this for the moment. I'm going to put that in another module. Now, heading back to helper function.js, which I've just created, what I want to do is to export both of these functions. So I'm exporting from helper function, of helper functions it should be. So I want to export from helper functions, and then in script.js import what helper functions is exporting. So exporting from this module, which is effectively a child module, into script, which is the parent module. So how do I do this? Well, one really easy way to do it is you can use the export keyword and just place it in front of the function definitions. So that's nice and straightforward. So if I save that now, these are now both being exported from helper functions.js. Now, at the top of this script, I can import it. So I use the keyword import, and then I need to name what it is I'm importing. So in this file, I'm taking format currency. Now, if I've got two exports in a file and I want to import them both, then I can import them by opening curly braces and then adding them in a comma separated list. So format currency and generate ID. So they are being imported from, so I need to specify where they're being imported from, and they're being imported from this directory, so /helper functions, and I need to remember the JS at the end there. Now I'm calling generate ID here. This should now be working, hopefully. So this is updating live, so I'm going to keep updating it so you can see that I'm calling it and it's generating a unique ID each time. So I'm calling generate ID, but it's no longer in script.js, it's in helper functions. I'm exporting it, and then I'm importing it, and then console logging it. So I don't clutter my script.js with defining generate ID or format currency in case I want to use format currency. So this is one way that you can do the export, place the keyword before the function, but I don't think this is the best way. Probably a cleaner way to do it is to use the export keyword at the bottom of the file and then list the things you want to export. So in this case, format currency and generate ID. Now to do that, I need to open curly braces again, and again, comma separated list. Okay, and that's going to work. So I should now be able to use, this should still be working, okay? So I'm exporting both down here. Now I'm going to comment this out. Just want to show you that if you try exporting without curly braces, so if I make a reference to the format currency function, this isn't going to work. You can only use a keyword export before the definition of a function or a variable. So I could export it under a new name like this, const x, and then I'm now exporting format currency under this new name x, so I would import it as x, but this isn't a very nice way to do it because I have to change the name. Maybe I don't want to change the name. So the way that you can change the name without doing that is if you're using the curly braces, you can just say as and then give it a new name. So I'm going to do that with generate ID. I'm going to say I want this in proper camel case, so lowercase d at the end. Oh. So copy generate ID. I'm going to change that final d to lowercase. Now in my script.js, I need to import generate ID with a lowercase d at the end. So I need to make this change here. And then I need to make this change to the call. And now I'm importing with this new name. Now you can also change the name when you're importing it. So I could say as x here, and then I run x, and that should hopefully still be working. So I'll refresh it a couple of times. You can see that it's now called x in my main file, but I prefer generate ID. I just wanted to show you that that is also possible. So I need to change that now to generate ID. So I've got my helper functions module here, and I'm exporting from that, and I'm importing into script.js. So I've already made my file a bit cleaner, but I've still got this myFetch function. I'd like to do a similar thing with myFetch, and this also gives me an opportunity to show you how to use the default keyword after export, because in this module there's only going to be one thing that I'm exporting. So I'm going to create another module. This time I'm going to call it myFetch. And inside myFetch, I'm going to copy and paste this entire function. Okay, so now you can see that my file script.js is much cleaner, much more manageable. And I'm going to save these. Now inside myFetch, I've got this function that will make fetch requests for me, and all I need to do is pass in the URL or the endpoint, the type, so whether it's a get, post, put or delete request, and then the data if, so that's an optional parameter in case I'm making a post or put request. So what I can do here is go down here, and I might want to use, in this case, because there's just this function, export default, and then the name of the function, so that would be myFetch. Okay, and now myFetch is the default export. So what does that mean? Well, it means when I'm importing, I can just say import, and then I can call this actually whatever I want. I'm just going to call it myFetch again, but you can call it something else because it's the default. Because it's the default export now, you don't have to specify exactly what it is. And then from, and now this is in a different module, so I'm going to enter that, myFetch.js. Now myFetch is available to me. So I'm going to get rid of this generate ID and just console log myFetch to make sure it's there. So let's have a look, and you can see that the function is available to me. I've just logged a reference to the function. I haven't used it right now, but I can start using the function. So, and I'll just to show you, I can call this anything I want. So I could call this X, and it's going to have the same result. I'll just refresh, because the default export is what you are importing. You don't need any of the curly braces. There's only one thing it's exporting. So when you've got a module that is doing one thing and exporting one thing, then it's usually better practice and more conventional to use the export default keyword rather than exporting the thing and then using the curly braces like we did when we had two. So we have to do this when we have two. By the way, you can also have a default export and non-default exports. So if I was in my helper functions and I wanted to make, let's make the generate ID my default, then I could say export default. and I'll say generate ID, and I'm just going to have the format currency there. And then in my script, I can say up here, so format currency is the non-default, so I need to name that, but I can import here. I'll call it, what was it called? Generate ID, so I'm going to give it the lower camel case from helper functions, so VS Code very cleverly knew where I was going with that one. And now you can see generate ID, this should be working again. Okay, so there's a slight problem here. I forgot the JS at the end of the helper functions, so don't forget that, otherwise it won't work. So here you can see this generate ID function, and I'll just execute it so you can see it's working. So you can have a default function, sorry, you can have a default export, you can have non-default exports, and you can have both in one module. Now, returning to the myFetch, which is the default export from myfetch.js. So what I want to do is call it here. So this is actually an asynchronous function. This is an asynchronous process. MyFetch, it returns a promise. So if I want to, call it, I have to say myFetch. And then the arguments I need to pass in are, first of all, I want the endpoint. So an endpoint you can use just for testing is httpbin.org/get. So that's just going to return some trivial information to you. The main thing is that we're using the function and we know that it's working. The second argument I need to specify is what type of request this is. So this is a GET request, and the third is the data that I would pass in, but this is a GET request, so I don't need to do that. And because it returns a promise, I have to use I can use async await, or I can use promise syntax. So I'm just going to use promise syntax here, and I want to here just log the result to the console. You can see here that this worked, and we've got back this object as the result of our GET request. So now we've got the fetch function, the generate ID function, and the format currency function available to us all inside this script.js file without defining them. We've just got these import statements at the top. So now script.js is much better organized, and it can also be more efficient. So I don't have to import all of these things. I could just import what I want. So if I know that I'm only going to be making a fetch request, I could delete these. I'm just going to comment these out in this tutorial, but if you know you're not going to use them, you wouldn't write them out in the first place. So you would just write out the import of fetch, and then you're only loading the myFetch function. You're not loading format currency, you're not loading generate ID, and you don't need to because it's not necessary. If you do decide that you want to use them, then you can add an import statement. So that's how using modules can increase the loading time of your JavaScript, because you're only loading the functionality that you need to do whatever you're doing in the main file, script.js in this case. Now finally, the really cool thing about modules is it's very easy to share your code with others and for others to share their code with you. So for example, I have this myFetch function here that I created myself, so there's a lot of code here. If you download this code and put it in a module, you can go ahead and start using this myFetch function yourself. So I'm going to post a link to this myFetch function in the card below this video, and then you can copy and paste it, and then I would advise trying to start using this in your own project. So the arguments are the endpoint for an API request, the type of request you're making as a string, so get, post, put, delete, and finally any data that you want to pass in. So as a practice, I would try taking this source code, putting it into a module, and then running it in a parent script, just so you know that you're getting the hang of it and everything is working. So that is it for this introductory tutorial on JavaScript modules. I hope you found this video useful. If you did and you'd like to see more content like this from us, don't forget to like this video and also subscribe to the channel.